Hey guys, tonight we begin with the blood-soaked hands and weary eyes of womened death in their pal who held life A&Ms. The Roman midwives, those unsung guardians of birth and survival in an empire built on conquest and stone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. in ancient Rome. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and somewhere in the labyrinth of narrow streets, a woman's scream pierces the darkness. Not the scream of violence or terror, but something primal, ancient, inevitable. Birth is coming, and with it, the shadow of death that follows every Roman delivery like a hungry wolf. In moments like these, when the gods seemed to hold their breath, there was only one person the family would summon. Not a priest, not a physician, but a midwife. A woman whose calloused hands had guided thousands of souls into the world, and whose tired eyes had seen just as many slip away before they could draw their first breath. You see, in a world where half of all children died before their 5th birthday, where childbirth was the leading cause of death for women, where medical knowledge was a patchwork of superstition and brutal trial and error, the midwife wasn't just a healthcare provider, she was a sorceress of survival, a keeper of secrets, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of shadows that claimed so many mothers and babies. She was feared and revered in equal measure, trusted with the most intimate moments of life, yet often blamed when those moments turned to tragedy. Tonight, we're going to step into her world. We're going to walk through the smoky, herb-scented chambers where Roman women laboured and died. We're going to understand what it truly meant to be a midwife in an empire where medicine was primitive, pain was constant, and every birth was a gamble with fate itself. This isn't the sanitized version of history you learned in school. This is raw, unflinching, and absolutely fascinating in its brutal honesty. The Roman Empire, for all its architectural marvels and military might, was a dangerous place to be born. And if you were a woman whose calling was to help other women through the most perilous experience of their lives, well, you were walking into a profession that demanded everything from you. Your sleep, your sanity, your reputation, and quite possibly your life. Let's start with who these women actually were, because the Hollywood version of ancient Rome rarely shows us the blood-stained aprons and exhausted faces of the obstetrics, as they were called. The word itself tells us something important. Obstetrics, meaning she who stands before. Before what? Before the mystery of birth. Before the moment when life emerges from darkness, before the terrible choice between mother and child that sometimes had to be made in those dim, smoky rooms. Most Roman midwives came from the lower classes. They were often former slaves who had earned their freedom, or the wives and daughters of craftsmen who needed additional income. This wasn't a profession for the wealthy or well-born. No senator's daughter decided one morning that she wanted to spend her nights elbow-deep in afterbirth and screaming. This was work for women who understood hardship, who had felt the sting of poverty and the weight of necessity pressing down on their shoulders. Many learned their trade from their mothers or aunts, passed down through generations like a family curse and blessing combined. Others apprenticed under established midwives, watching and learning through years of terrifying nights and desperate dawns. There were no medical schools for women, no formal training programs, no certificates or licenses. You learned by doing, by watching, by making mistakes that sometimes cost lives, and by developing an almost supernatural intuition about when things were going wrong. The training yielding water, by grinding by holding basins and bow, was brutal in its simplicity. You start herbs and mixing potions whose recipes were guarded more carefully than state secrets. You learned to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. The color of a woman's face, the rhythm of her breathing, the particular quality of her cries that meant the baby was positioned wrong or the cord was wrapped around its neck. You learned to work with tools that were little more than crude metal instruments, to perform procedures that would make modern doctors shudder, all while maintaining the calm, confident demeanor that laboring women desperately needed. But here's what made Roman midwives truly remarkable. In a society that generally viewed women as property, these women wielded genuine authority. When a midwife walked into a room, even the paterfamilias, the all-powerful head of the household, stepped back and let her take control. She decided who could stay and who had to leave. She determined what treatments would be tried and when it was time to give up hope. In those moments of crisis, she became the ultimate authority, more powerful than senators, more crucial than generals. The demand for their services was constant and crushing. Roman women, especially those from wealthy families, often had pregnancy after pregnancy in hopes of producing surviving sons to carry on the family name. The infant mortality rate was staggering. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some areas, up to 60% of children died before reaching adulthood. This meant that a successful midwife was always working, always on call, always one urgent summons away from another life or death struggle. Their days began before dawn and often stretched well into the following morning. Birth doesn't wait for convenient hours, and Roman midwives learned to function on fragments of sleep, snatched between deliveries. They carried their tools in leather bags, walking through the dark streets of Rome with their heads covered, moving like ghosts between the houses of the living and the dying. The tools themselves were a mixture of practical necessity and desperate improvisation. Bronze forceps, though primitive and dangerous by modern standards, were used to extract babies who had died in the womb. Birthing chairs, carved from wood and sometimes decorated with protective symbols, gave laboring women a more effective position than lying flat. Sharp knives were used for emergency procedures that I won't describe in detail, but which sometimes meant choosing between saving the mother or the child when both couldn't survive. Pain management was virtually non-existent. Roman midwives relied on a combination of herbal remedies, distraction techniques, and sheer determination. They used willow bark, which contains the same compounds as modern aspirin, though in unpredictable doses. They burned sweet-smelling herbs to calm the mother's nerves and drive away evil spirits. They told stories, sang songs, and offered constant encouragement, knowing that a woman's mental state could mean the difference between a successful delivery and a tragic ending. The social dynamics were complex and often tense. Wealthy Roman families wanted the best midwives money could buy, but they also needed someone they could blame if things went wrong. A midwife who lost too many mothers or babies would quickly find herself without clients, her reputation destroyed by whispered accusations of incompetence or witchcraft. Yet the same families who might turn on her in grief were entirely dependent on her skills and experience. The relationship between midwives and male physicians was particularly complicated. Roman doctors, who were almost exclusively men, often looked down on midwives as ignorant women practicing folk medicine. Yet these same doctors had virtually no training in childbirth and often caused more harm than good when they tried to intervene. Many midwives developed a deep mistrust of male medical practitioners, knowing that their interference could turn a difficult but manageable birth into a disaster. What's truly remarkable is how much these women understood about the birthing process, despite having no knowledge of germ theory, no understanding of proper sterilization, and no access to modern medical equipment. Through generations of observation and experience, they had developed techniques for dealing with breech births, prolonged labor, and hemorrhaging that were surprisingly effective. They knew which herbs could speed up contractions and which could slow them down. They understood the importance of keeping the birthing area as clean as possible, even if they didn't understand why. The emotional toll of this work was enormous. Imagine spending your life intimately involved in moments of the greatest joy and the deepest tragedy. You celebrated when a healthy baby took its first breath. but you also held dying women's hands as they whispered final messages for their other children. You delivered babies who were born already dead, their tiny bodies blue and still. You watched families torn apart by grief and guilt, and you carried the weight of knowing that sometimes, despite all your skill and experience, there was nothing you could do to change the outcome. Roman society had complex beliefs about childbirth that made the midwife's job even more challenging. Birth was seen as a time when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the gods became thin and permeable. This meant that supernatural forces were believed to be at work during every delivery, and the midwife was expected to not only provide medical care, but also serve as a spiritual guardian, protecting mother and child from malevolent spirits and divine displeasure. The rituals surrounding birth were as important as the practical medical care, and midwives were expected to master both. They carried amulets and charms, not out of simple superstition, but because failing to perform the proper protective rituals could result in accusations of negligence or worse. They burned specific incenses at particular moments during labour, recited prayers to Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, and carefully disposed of the placenta according to ancient customs that were believed to influence the child's future. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of a Roman midwife's job was the legal and social consequences of failure. In a society where women were already viewed with suspicion, a midwife who lost too many patients could find herself accused of poisoning or witchcraft. The line between bad luck and criminal negligence was often determined by the grief and anger of bereaved families, rather than any objective assessment of the midwife's actions. Consider the case of Scribonia Attis, a midwife whose story survives in fragmentary legal documents from the 2nd century. After a particularly difficult delivery that resulted in the death of both mother and child, she was accused by the woman's husband of deliberately causing the deaths through the use of harmful potions. The trial lasted for months, during which Attis was held in prison, her reputation destroyed, her livelihood gone. Even after she was eventually acquitted, no family would hire her services again. She died in poverty, another casualty of a profession that offered no safety net for those who dedicated their lives to it. The economic realities were harsh and unforgiving. While successful midwives who served wealthy families could earn decent money, they were paid per delivery, not per hour of labour. A difficult birth that lasted 2 or 3 days meant 2 or 3 days without sleep, without other income, often without even proper meals. And there was no guarantee of payment if the outcome was unsuccessful. Grieving families sometimes refused to pay at all, claiming the midwife's failure absolved them of financial obligation. Most midwives lived hand to mouth, using the income from successful deliveries to buy herbs and supplies for future cases. They had to maintain their own equipment, replace broken tools, and stock their medicine bags with expensive imported ingredients. A single robbery or a string of unsuccessful cases could leave them destitute, unable to work, because they lacked the basic supplies their profession required. The physical demands were relentless and destructive. Midwives spent hours bent over labouring women, their backs twisted into painful positions as they tried to assist with difficult births. Their hands were constantly exposed to blood and bodily fluids, leading to infections and diseases that they had no way to treat effectively. Many developed arthritis in their fingers from the repetitive motions of massage and manipulation. Their knees, worn down by years of kneeling beside birthing beds, often became so damaged that they could barely walk in their later years. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion. Birth doesn't follow schedules, and midwives learned to function in a state of chronic exhaustion that would be considered dangerous in any modern profession. They developed an almost supernatural ability to wake instantly when summoned, to think clearly despite overwhelming fatigue, and to make life or death decisions while operating on just a few hours of rest over several days. The seasonal patterns of their work added another layer of complexity. Winter births were particularly dangerous as cold temperatures increased the risk of infection and made it harder to keep mothers and newborns warm. Spring brought its own challenges, as this was traditionally the time when Roman couples tried to conceive, leading to a surge of births in late winter and early spring that could overwhelm even experienced midwives. Summer deaths were common, as heat and humidity created perfect conditions for the spread of disease. Midwives learned to recognize the signs of puerperal fever, the infection that killed so many new mothers in the days following delivery. They knew the glazed look in a woman's eyes, the particular quality of her breathing, the way her skin felt when touched, that meant death was approaching. And they knew there was almost nothing they could do to stop it. The relationship between midwives and the broader medical community was fraught with tension and professional jealousy. Male physicians, who had received formal training and enjoyed higher social status, often dismissed midwives as ignorant practitioners of folk medicine. Yet these same physicians had virtually no experience with childbirth and often made situations worse when they tried to intervene. Some midwives developed working relationships with sympathetic doctors, men who recognized their expertise and were willing to consult with them on difficult cases. But these partnerships were rare and had to be conducted carefully, as both parties risked professional censure for crossing the rigid boundaries that separated men's and women's medical roles. The training of new midwives was an informal but intense process that could take years to complete. Young women who showed aptitude and interest were taken on as apprentices, starting with the most basic tasks like boiling water and preparing herbal mixtures. Gradually, they were allowed to assist with simpler deliveries, always under the watchful eye of an experienced practitioner. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Mistakes could cost lives, and there was no room for hesitation or uncertainty when crisis struck. Apprentices learned to read the subtle signs that indicated trouble was brewing, to anticipate complications before they became life-threatening, and to work quickly and efficiently even under extreme pressure. Many promising apprentices couldn't handle the emotional intensity of the work. Watching women die in agony, holding stillborn babies, comforting grieving families, these experiences broke some women before they could develop the emotional armor necessary to continue. Those who survived their training emerged as hardened professionals, capable of functioning in situations that would traumatize ordinary people. The knowledge they possessed was passed down through oral tradition, carefully guarded secrets that were shared only with trusted apprentices and close colleagues. Recipes for herbal remedies, techniques for dealing with specific complications, methods for determining whether a baby was positioned correctly. All of this wisdom was transmitted through whispered conversations and hands-on demonstration rather than written texts. The secrecy wasn't born from selfishness, but from necessity. In a world where knowledge meant survival, where a wrong word could lead to accusations of witchcraft, midwives learned to guard their expertise like precious coins. They spoke in code, used euphemisms for dangerous procedures, and never ever wrote down the recipes that could save a woman's life or end it just as quickly. The tools of their trade tell their own grim story. Archaeological excavations have uncovered birthing implements that look more like instruments of torture than medical equipment. Bronze speculums, crude and unforgiving, iron hooks designed to extract dead fetuses piece by piece, knives sharp enough to perform emergency procedures that had no names because no one wanted to speak of them aloud. These weren't the sterile, precise instruments of modern medicine. They were rough, handmade tools crafted by blacksmiths who had never seen childbirth and didn't particularly want to. The birthing chambers themselves were studies in controlled chaos. Wealthy families might provide a dedicated room, but more often, midwives worked wherever space could be found. Kitchen tables, bedroom floors, corners of workshops still warm from the day's labour. The air was thick with smoke from oil lamps and burning herbs, creating an atmosphere that was part medical facility, part religious shrine, part battlefield. Lighting was always a problem. Candles were expensive, oil lamps flickered and smoked, and dawn seemed impossibly far away during those long night vigils. Midwives learned to work by touch as much as sight, their fingers becoming extensions of their diagnostic skills. They could feel the position of a baby through the mother's abdomen, detect the subtle changes in pulse that indicated hemorrhaging, assess the progress of labour through touch alone. The sounds of these chambers haunt the historical record. Not just the expected cries of labouring women, but the whispered prayers of midwives calling on gods whose names are lost to time. The scrape of bronze instruments against stone floors. The splash of water being constantly boiled and reheated. The rustle of linen, torn into strips for bandages that would be used once and then burned. And underneath it all, the terrible silence that fell when things went wrong, when breathing stopped, when hope died. Roman law added its own cruel complications to the midwife's burden. If a woman died in childbirth, the midwife was required to attempt to save the child, even if it meant cutting the baby from its mother's corpse. This procedure, called the caesarean section, was performed only on dead women, as no one could survive such an operation without modern surgical techniques. The midwife had to work quickly, before the child suffocated, using whatever sharp implements she had available. The psychological impact of performing such procedures, often in front of grieving family members, cannot be overstated. These women witnessed humanity at its most vulnerable and most savage. They saw love and loss intertwined so closely that they became indistinguishable. They learned to compartmentalize horror, to function despite having seen things that would break most people. Yet they also witnessed miracles. Babies who seemed stillborn, suddenly gasping to life. Mothers who appeared to be dying, rallying at the last moment. Twins surviving when everyone expected loss. Complicated births that resolved themselves just when all seemed hopeless. These moments of triumph kept them going through the darkness. Small victories against the overwhelming odds they faced every day. The economic precariousness of their position meant that midwives could never refuse a case, no matter how dangerous or hopeless it seemed. Word travelled quickly in Roman communities, and a midwife who gained a reputation for being selective would soon find herself without any clients at all. They took on cases that male physicians wouldn't touch, situations so desperate that only someone with nothing left to lose would attempt them. Some developed specialties based on their particular skills or the demands of their clientele. Urban midwives who served wealthy families became experts at managing the complex social dynamics of elite households, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, how to navigate the politics of extended families, where multiple women might be pregnant simultaneously. Rural midwives learned to work alone for extended periods, making do with whatever supplies they could forage or improvise when proper medicines weren't available. The seasonal rhythms of their work created their own form of exhaustion. Spring and summer brought waves of births as families tried to time pregnancies to avoid winter deliveries. Autumn was a time of preparation, gathering herbs before they died back, checking and repairing equipment, trying to build up reserves of supplies and energy for the difficult months ahead. Winter was survival, pure and simple, fighting to keep mothers and babies alive in conditions that challenged even the most experienced practitioners. And so we closed the door on these forgotten chambers, leaving behind the blood-stained birthing stools and the echoes of ancient prayers. The Roman midwives, those weathered guardians of life's most dangerous threshold, fade back into history's shadows where they've waited for nearly 2,000 years to have their stories told. They were warriors without armour, fighting battles where victory meant a baby's first cry and defeat meant silence that would haunt them forever. In their calloused hands lay the fragile thread between existence and oblivion, and they held it steady through countless dark nights when hope seemed as fragile as morning frost. Sleep well, knowing their vigil has ended, but their courage echoes still.